So we have looked at parameters, and now we're going to take a look at select options. Now parameters are fantastic for letting the user select individual values that we want to filter on in our reports. But what do we do when we want to allow a range of values or multiple individual values? Well, it would be incorrect to create lots of separate parameters to store these values, all based on the same field. So this is where the select option statement comes into play. Now the first thing we need to consider when using a select option is that we are going to be using internal tables to store the values the user enters into the fields. A much more detailed discussion on how we create internal tables is coming up. But for now, we will just deal with what we need to know to use the select option statements in our program. So when an individual user wants to enter multiple individual values or select a value range, we need to store them in a table in memory that our program can use. And the internal table we create for a select table has a similar restriction to parameters in that we can only give them a name of up to 8 characters in length. And the select table themselves contain 4 separate fields which get defined when we create our select option statement. These fields are sign, option, low, and high. So before going any further, let's get these down in our program, just so you've got something to reference as I'm talking. So I said, when we use a select option statement, we have these 4 fields: sign, option, low, and high. When a user makes a choice by filling in a selection field on the screen, whether that is a single value or range of values, a record is generated and put into this internal table. And because it's a table, this allows the user to enter as many records as they wish, and all these records will be used to filter our data. So let's now get a little more granular and have a look at each one of these fields in the internal table. Now the sign field has a data type of C, a character, with a length of 1. The data stored in this field determines for each record whether or not the record is to be included or excluded from the result set that our report selects. And the possible values that get stored in this field are I and E. Now I stands for inclusive, so we are including the criteria, and E stands for exclusive. It's an exclusion criteria. Now the options field also has a type of C, character, but this one has a length of 2. And this field holds the selection operator. So for example, it can hold a value of EQ for equals, NE for not equals, GT, I'm sure you can work these out. Then we have a couple of special ones, CP, and lastly NP. And as you can see, they're the same type of logical operators as those that are used for logical expressions. But CP and NP do not have the full functional scope they have in normal logical expressions. Now if wildcard characters are entered onto the selection screen, the system will automatically use the operator CP. Now the low field is used to enter the lower limit for a range of values that a user can enter. And as you might guess, the high field is used as the upper limit for a range of values. Now both of these are low and high fields. Their data type is determined by the database table to which our selection criteria is linked. so the data type will vary. If the field we are selecting on is an integer, they will take on the data type of an integer. If it's a character, they'll use a character data type. When we define our select options, we can of course refer to fields in the database table, as well as defining individual fields in our program. When we define a select option field that refers to a database table field, the attributes of that field will automatically apply to the input fields on the selection screen. Why would we use a select option instead of a parameter? Well, if you recall back on our Z-Employees table we created, one of the fields is date of birth. Now we could create a parameter on the date of birth field and have the user enter a date of birth that we could then use in our program to select data from a database table. But you know, the date of birth field is very, very unique. Most of the records in our database table are going to have a unique date of birth. So if we use this field, we're at best going to get one record being returned for our program. And it's not flexible. We would require the user to know the exact date of birth of an employee. Whereas if we use a select option, we can give the user the functionality to allow them to use wildcards. They can use date ranges to select employees. You know, they could say the 1st of January 1960 to the 31st of December 1980 and return a whole bunch of records. They can exclude certain values and they can exclude ranges of values too. The select option is so much more functional than a single parameter field. You'll find users requesting this type of input field a lot more than a standard parameter. So enough of the talk, let's get straight on to having a look at how we define select options. So let me clear out this piece of text. And we'll come back up here, and then just below parameters, we can take a look at the syntax. So I just mentioned the date of birth field, so let's use that as our example. So the way we define a select option is simply by typing select-options. Then we declare a field we are going to use for our select option. So let's say my date of birth. Then just as with the parameters, we have to identify the field type for the select option. And this is where we include for, and then we can say Z employees, and I think it's ZDOB. Let me save this and I'll just double check. Oh, it's not ZDOB, it's just DOB. I'll just pretty it up. And there we go, that's all you need to do to define a select option field. Let's have a look at how it gets displayed on the screen. So I'll just execute the program after I've activated it. Oh, we have some errors. Oh, I didn't take away all the rubbish text. There we go. Let me just get rid of this other program I was working on. So now it's active, we can execute, and here we go. You can see the My Date of Birth field that we just declared, and you can see we have two fields we can input, and a button. Users can now enter a single value into the low field, which is this one on the left, and they can also enter a value into the right-hand field, which is the high field. So just by having these two fields, let's do this, we can have a range. So now our select option low field will contain the 1st of July and the high field will contain the 30th of July. Now if a user didn't enter anything into this field, then our table is going to be blank. It won't have any records generated. Now you might be wondering, what's that button on the right? Well, this is where we get a load more functionality. Let me click it and then I will explain. So now we get this pop-up box. And as you can see, we've got 4 tabs along the top. Here we can enter individual single values for this field. And it doesn't matter what sequence you put them in. You can enter as many individual values as you wish. And also, hopefully you're familiar with how these work, but if you have, let's say, 50 entries, 50 single values you want to put in there that you have in a spreadsheet or something like that, you can copy those values to the clipboard, click on an empty line, and then just paste them in. So you've got functionality down here to allow you to paste, remove records, delete every record there is on the screen. So go through these and have a look. Now, let's move on to the next tab, and this is ranges. So where we could enter a single range in our first low and high value here, we can actually go to ranges and enter multiple range values. So we could say the 1st of May to the 5th of May, then the 10th of May to the 15th of May, and so on. Now, you'll notice 2 of these tabs have got the green square, and then 2 have got red circles. So the green, that indicates we are going to include values in our selection criteria. And if we click onto the red, any values we enter here will be excluded. So the internal table, if we step back to it, as I mentioned previously, has a sign field, an option field, a high. Sorry, it's a low first, then a high. So by filling in those fields on the green square tabs, our sign field will get filled with the inclusion. And if we fill in anything on the red circle tabs, this value will be equal to E, indicating we are going to exclude values. We'll just comment that out and we'll go back to the screen again. Actually, let's step back here. Now the other thing to highlight is these fields. I mentioned you can include wildcard characters and things like that. Well, you can also include the logical operators. So remember, we have the option field. Well, if I right click here and choose options, then we get a list of logical operators that we can assign to the individual fields on our select option records. So by default, it's always going to use the equal sign. But if we wanted to say less than or equal to, we can double click and we get the little graphical representation of the less than and equal to, and then we can fill in the value. And the same on the 2. Just right click, select option, and you can choose any you want. And you'll notice we also have the green and the red options down here. So it's include or exclude. And just as we have on this single line, if you bring up the multiple selection dialog box, you can see it's carried through the single selection. And as with the other tabs, we can do exactly the same type of thing. Just instead of right clicking, we just click on the little button at the side and it'll bring up the select options.